Get started. Welcome, everyone. You see how I have my special Halloween black screen behind me. I'm Maggie Gallagher. I am the executive director of the Benedict XVI Institute for Sacred Music and Divine Worship. Our mission is opening the door of beauty to God. We were founded by Archbishop Cordileone, and we serve our mission through two great strategies, one of which you're participating in today: resources for more beautiful and reverent liturgies, and energizing a Catholic culture of the arts. And if I can put in a plug before we go, we introduce our panelists. And can I pause and ask Jesse Russell if he's around to unmute himself?
Yes, I am right here.
So I can find you.
I don't know where I am.
Jesse?
Yes.
Maybe not yet. I just sent that out. So hopefully he'll join us.
I should be.
On November 6th, we will be celebrating the world premiere. Whoops.
Excuse me, Dr. Russell.
What happened?
Right here.
You look like you were in someone's
I can't hear you at all. Wait a minute. Let me turn up my volume. What are you saying, Sarah?
Forgive me for
okay.
I just wanted you to let you know that Dr. Russell is here. I'm trying to help you co-host by muting people as they come in.
Yeah, everyone, thank you. And I may have to mute everybody. We're still getting latecomers, obviously, because of our technical glitch, but I'm really more pleased that so many of you are here. And thank you. And thank you. I will get to the panel. But as I was saying, on November 6th at the Cathedral of St. Mary of the Assumption, we will be celebrating a world premiere celebration of the Requiem Mass for the Homeless, which Archbishop Cordileone commissioned from the brilliant and wonderful composer Frank LaRocca. We commissioned a new painting of the patron saints of the homeless, which will be set up as a shrine in the back of the church. The noted poet James Matthew Wilson composed a litany to the patron saints, which we will chant after the Mass as we process with the Archbishop down to the Tenderloin, which is the part of the poorest neighborhood in San Francisco. And thanks to the hospitality of St. Anthony's Dining Hall, we'll all break bread together. I hope we will have a number of what we're calling our homeless VIPs, so that we can all together pray for the souls of those who died on the streets in San Francisco, before the God who loves each one of us, no matter how successful we are or how challenging our life is, or how beautiful or ugly others find us. And I think it's going to be an amazing example of the intersection of our missions, which is more beautiful and reverent liturgy and energizing a Catholic culture of the arts. And you will, in fact, be able to watch the Mass, at least, on the live stream of the Cathedral of St. Mary of the Assumption, and actually on the Archdiocese of San Francisco. So look for that. We will send out a link so you can watch. And if you are anywhere in the greater Bay Area, come. There will be a wonderful conference afterwards featuring composers, Stanford sacred music professor, William P. Mart. James Matthew Wilson will be there, and the painter Bernadette Carstensen. We're going to hear a lecture on beauty and human dignity. The Archbishop has just drafted a wonderful op-ed on this, which is coming out in National Catholic Register, I believe, very shortly. And then we'll go in, kind of amazing, we'll go into the beautiful St. Patrick's Seminary Chapel, which is really a beautiful and gorgeous and holy place. And we'll listen to 3 tantum ergos by 3 living Catholic artists, one of which was specially commissioned for this event by a young composer named Robert Chastain, who used to be in San Francisco. And since he married, of course, now he has to live in Sacramento, good place. But hardly anyone can afford to raise a family in San Francisco these days. Okay, I digress. Anyway, November 6th, and we will be sending it out in our how you can see it by the live stream in my next newsletter, along with some other updates. So I just wanted to make sure you're aware of that. And without further ado, vampires, werewolves, and serial killers. Oh my. We're very fortunate to have here two very fine Catholic writers and novelists, Eleanor Borg Nicholson, who wrote her first novel, was called A Bloody Habit, and it is a vampire novel. And her latest novel is called Brother Wolf, and it features werewolves. And we have a debut novel by Sarah. Is that? Oh no, that's not new. A debut novel by Sarah Cortez, who's been a great friend of the Benedict XVI Institute. She helps us edit and writes for our magazine, CatholicArtsToday.com, which, another plug, I think is it's an online magazine and the only magazine in the world dedicated primarily to the life and the work of living Catholic artists across all the disciplines. And probably more importantly, she's a significant poet herself. I like to refer to her as the cop poet. I don't know if she ever gets tired of that, but it is a distinction. And thank you for your service in protecting the public as well as for your art. But more recently, she founded an extraordinary organization called Catholic Literary Arts. And in the old Zoom room, I put links up to it, but it's catholicliteraryarts.org. And she has online seminars on a variety of topics, very interesting for writers, and really wonderful writing workshops for high school students in the Houston area. So check it out, catholicliteraryarts.org. And then I was really happy, I believe it was Sarah who recommended Professor Jesse Russell, who is at Georgia Southwestern State University. And he is a Steubenville undergraduate, and he writes about many things. But most recently, he has two works coming out, both of which I find it very interesting. One is called The Redemption of Geoffrey Hill. And Professor Russell, that refers to the British poet Geoffrey Hill, or is it some other Geoffrey Hill?
No, that is the late Anglican or quasi-Anglican poet Geoffrey Hill. That is correct.
I just, after reviewing your work, I just ordered a copy of that and also his poetry, which I wasn't as aware of as I should be. But then our great fine poets are not as famous as they should be either in America. He's a British poet, but anyway. And then another work, which is called Liberalism and Fantasy in the Films of Christopher Nolan. And let's mute everybody, and then let's let the panelists unmute themselves. I think we've got everyone here. It's a good room of 55 people, so that's a big room for a book reading, right? So we're here today because it's a few days before All Hallows Eve, which is it's not a holiday, but it's an invention of the Catholic imagination. The sense that on our November 1st, also, we need to mute everybody. Come on, guys, mute yourself. Thank you. That the night before All Souls Day, the souls in the other world who are not celebrated on Saints' Day are restless, and somehow the barriers are more permeable. And I thought that would be a good time to investigate these and to converse with really, these two Catholic novelists about how being a Christian who believes that the supernatural is real affects the craft of writing, what you might lump generally together as Gothic or even noir fiction. they're not usually lumped together as genres, but they both have a certain taste for seeing evil very clearly, and maybe a differential depending on the author, understanding the supernatural reality of the good as well. So let me start. That's a long introduction, but let me start. Take 10 minutes and let's just chat with each of our guests here and get to know them. A little bit later, we're going to open it up for you to ask your questions or comments or make somewhat short speeches with your views on this topic. And Eleanor, can you say something so you pop up on the screen there?
Hello, Maggie. Can you hear me?
I do. I can see you too. And I see that you write a great deal. There was a great interview with you in Catholic World Report, which I enjoyed reading. And you do some scholarly critical work as well, but most famously, you're here because you're a creative Catholic artist as well. And how you procreate and create as an artist is, I'm sure, a topic of interest for some of the young women here. So let me start with, I understand you became a novelist because you had a nightmare in a Dominican convent or friary, or where were you? And what was the nightmare?
I was staying with some Dominican nuns. I'd actually been published. I have a novella, which is not Gothic. But I was staying with some Dominican nuns on a writing retreat and doing scholarly work. And a Dominican friar of my acquaintance was there teaching the nuns. We had a meal together. And he said, when you're on retreat, you need to do something important. And I sort of sat up straighter, tried to look intelligent. And he said, take a nap. So I felt a little deflated, but I'm obedient. So I went and tried to take a nap the next day. And right before I fell asleep, I looked at an image of Veronica's veil on the wall and I thought, you know, Catholics would be better at battling the preternatural because we're weirder than the preternatural. It looks like a disembodied floating head on a gold background. Then I fell asleep. I had a nightmare and I woke up and I wrote the first chapter of Bloody Habit. And it was working on themes that I'd been delving into for a very long time. My academic background is Victorian literature, and I specialized in, believe it or not, anti-Catholicism of the British Victorian period and the ways that those authors would appropriate a Catholic aesthetic where they'd thrown out the sacramental reality, but they needed all the Catholic stuff to convey something greater than just the natural world. So if they wanted to scare you, they brought in a Jesuit. If they wanted to say monsters were there, you had to have rosaries and crucifixes, and as in Dracula, imported consecrated hosts from Europe. So I've been working in this a long time. I did edit the Ignatius Critical Edition of Dracula along with some other non-Gothic novels. But no, it's a fun genre to play in. I see several of my homeschool connection students are actually here, and they know that I get very excited to play in the Gothic playground because it's so full of outrageous pieces. So
who do you consider, when you looked at anti-Catholicism in British Victorian literature, who pops to mind in that? I'm a big fan of Victorian literature.
It's everywhere. I'd say the most dramatic offender that comes to mind is Charlotte Bronte. She's a perfect example because she puts the Catholic aesthetic in, very Catholic characters. Her heroes usually are saturated in Catholicism, but they're also super abusive. So she has this sort of attraction repulsion thing going where she wants the Catholic fella and she wants the Catholic stuff, but she spends a lot of time beating that particular topic or that particular character until she can stabilize her own Protestant conscience and let her heroine have the Catholic hero. So Charlotte Bronte, definitely. But you see it in tiny ways. If you want to read the really bad Matthew Gregory Lewis, The Monk, it's a Gothic nightmare and it's appalling. It's so badly written, but it's built on several hundred years of anti-Catholic understanding. It's what John Henry Newman called a tradition floating on the air. The British have a serious hang-up. I laughed when you said, we don't know our Catholic poets very well. The major Catholic poets of the Victorian period never could be poet laureate because they were Catholic.
Right.
Sarah Manley Hopkins, forget it. I think Joseph Pierce considers him, I might be misquoting Joseph, but considers him the greatest poet of the period. No, can't touch him with a 10-foot pole because he's a papist. But by the end of the period, with someone like Bram Stoker, who's a Protestant Irishman, he's not as hung up. So it's a pretty different dynamic when you get to Dracula. He sort of throws all the Catholic stuff in, hodgepodge with everything else he's throwing into the pot, and has a grand time. And like I said, he's not hung up. His characters are hung up and they freak out. There's this wonderful scene early in the book where Jonathan Harker is given a crucifix, or it might be a rosary. Bram Stoker's not sure. And he says, you know, what is this thing? Oh, I feel so awkward. This peasant pushed it on me. But then when he's assaulted by Count Dracula and he's terrified out of his mind, he's clinging to it and saying, what is this thing? Is there something in it that it consoles me? Maybe it has a special power. It conveys a power. I'll think about this later on. He never does because he's a good Protestant Englishman.
It's funny you mentioned Charlotte Bronte because I'm the novel of hers that I'm fondest of is Villette, right? Which is
it's actually, if you look up anti-Catholicism in British literature, British Victorian literature, that one is touted as the most anti-Catholic.
Well, it's interesting. It did not strike me that way. I mean, I think what you said otherwise is really what's apparent. There's a rather sympathetic portrayal of a Catholic priest who she turns to an extremity and then, you know, kind of runs away from that experience and ends up, you know, saying she doesn't like his creed, but she thanks him for being kind to her in one of her nightmarish moments. So that sense, I mean, really, of course, the English split with the Catholic Church happened differently than the rest of the Reformation, and of course, there's all this tornness between high ritual symbolism. They kept the Blessed Virgin Mary more than most Protestants did. And I can see that attraction, repulsion, national identity issue. It's very striking to me now that a number of the really fine filmmakers, in particular, are British Irishmen. You know, who what's the name of the two brothers? One of them did this really extraordinary film called Calvary, the McDonough brothers, and the other did. The 3 billboards in Ebbing, Mississippi, which won an Oscar, and he's fascinated by what he calls suicidal Christ figures. Anyway, more. Maybe I'm getting more in the weeds here. How did you? So you providing the vampire, and then why did you move on to werewolves as your next subject for a novel?
It sort of felt inevitable. Because I had already done the vampires, and it was something my husband said. I was theorizing after A Bloody Habit came out, and I said, vampire victims are like addicts. And I told him my whole theory. And he listened. And about 3 days later, he came back to me and said, no, werewolves are like addicts. And then he outlined his theory. And I got so excited and said, well, now I have to do the werewolves. And I sort of had to anyway, because I opened that door. And to explore this idea of a radical predisposition towards lycanthropy being a demonstration of addiction, but also of our own fallen natures of concupiscence. I like to call it concupiscence in Technicolor. You know, it's just dramatic, but we're all monstrous. Karen Yulo, the author of Jennifer the Damned, she has said over and over that the reason monster stories resonate with us is because we know our own monstrousness and our need for grace. So it's a really exciting area to be playing in. And I've said this over and over, when you get into the werewolves and you get into the vampires, when you get into ghosts and ghouls, you can get away with talking about big topics like life and death, damnation, salvation. You can't do that in a drawing room comedy without coming off as slightly preachy.
Yeah, that was interesting. I'm also struck how your work in these genres takes on directly the problem of disenchantment of the modern world, which I'm thinking of the essay which the former editor of First Things, one in between Richard Newhouse and Rusty Reno, wrote so beautifully about this sense that Catholicism, people saw in Catholicism, and he was lamenting in a way the flattening down of the faith into moral issues in a way that certainly makes me uncomfortable, but he's getting at something else with his, and I think you're getting at that too, which is when you take out the drama of good and evil, what's left is dull and somewhat tasteless.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
Maggie, I might put that a different way. I think it's, you know, the difference between literature that has a moral center and literature that does not.
Yeah.
Maybe that's part of why the crime story, even though it sort of began, its flourishing began in Great Britain. I think its most remarkable flourishing has actually, especially in the short story arena, has been in American fiction. And I wonder if Dr. Russell might speak to that. I mean, I can come at it from a practitioner's viewpoint because I've edited so many anthologies of short crime fiction, and I love short crime fiction. But I'd love to hear what maybe Dr. Russell has to say on some of that.
Well, I think that, okay. Yeah, I think that, well, you know, the earliest noir works in both the United States and Europe, I think, are dealing with the post-World War II era and the sense of like ennui and boredom that people felt. And at the same time, there was this idea that like the United States and the kind of new Western democracies had triumphed over all this terrible evil, which is true. But then within the system itself, there's this tremendous corruption. So the stereotypical Raymond Chandler novel is pulling at a thread in a sweater and then looking behind it and kind of coming to terms with that. And I think in a certain level, it's very Augustinian. I mean, one of the things St. Augustine of Hippo attempts to prove rhetorically in the Confessions is that evil exists. Now, he doesn't go through all of the terrible things that are going on other than what had gone on in his own soul. But I think it points to the need to for redemption. It's noir fiction is almost romantic in the sense that it's trying to, I don't want to say re-enchant the world, but to point out that there is more going on there than simply the day-to-day existence of 20th century bourgeois life. And so neo-noir, which a lot of it emerges in the 1990s, and 80s is the same idea. We have the triumph of Reagan and then the triumph of Clinton, the Blair era. Everything's great. We all kinds of money and all this free stuff and everything's going great. But underneath that, there is an evil, or there are things that we encounter that are supernatural and that are moral. So it's not simply the case that, well, now we finally have the internet and the triumph over communism and we have the end of history.
Yeah, I was thinking about one of the first anthologies I edited in crime fiction was for teens. And so I did a lot of research, a lot of reading. All the authors were Hispanic, and it was a way to bring together short stories written by Hispanic authors and many different kinds of Hispanic authors, you know, Puerto Rican, American, Mexican American, and many other countries. And there was some very interesting research I read from the American Library Association that said basically kids, elementary, high school, even middle school, given free time in a library, the reading choices they make most often are of mystery fiction. And this research was suggesting or proposing, sort of wondering about the fact that at least in before you get into the postmodern mystery novel where the mystery is never solved, before that, the mystery is always solved. So in a way, good always triumphs over evil. may not reference religion or spirituality whatsoever, but that dynamic is very present.
I think that's very important, Sarah. And as a lover of mystery fiction, I know the satisfaction of that when you were saying the postmodern mystery fiction that doesn't have the resolution. In my opinion, it fails. It does not satisfy. You want justice, and even if it's not fully realized, you want a sense that it could be realized. Just sort of a nebulous, nihilistic. It makes for a bad plot.
I think it's one of the reasons that fiction has been less corrupted by postmodernism than other genres, is that if you start to lose the basic dramatic structure, there really isn't any story left, right? It's people have tried, and James Joyce pushed the boundaries, and I don't actually like Ulysses because I feel like I have more things to do in my life than master this enormous private language, but that's maybe my Philistinism coming out. I do like The Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man very much. But Sarah, I wanted to get to you and your new novel, The Carlucci Betrayal. Tell us about how you decided to move after a successful career publishing as a poet, and in the middle of launching this extremely important new organization, Catholic Literary Arts.org. What prompted you to write a novel, and in particular this novel?
Well, probably as often happens to many of us, coincidences occur. Although those of us that believe in God know there's no such thing as a coincidence. I've been a freelance editor and writer for many, many years, and I received a call one day from a gentleman and who is actually listed on the book as co-author, and he wanted a developmental edit for a novel that he had been working on after an extremely successful career as an eye surgeon. And so I did that for him, but then he asked me he retained me. I guess the term is he retained my services to rewrite the novel. And so that's what I did. And so he and I collaborated, in a way, it was a coming together of many things that interest me. Number one, mystery fiction. Even back in the days of Nancy Drew and, those kind of sort of very outdated, sort of naive kind of approaches to mystery fiction. I've always loved the puzzle aspect and probably the justice aspect as well. But it also brought together, and I don't know how many of the people in your audience know, but I've been a police officer for almost 30 years. And I went into policing not as a first career choice, but about a third or fourth career choice, and was a patrol officer for years, loved it, and worked in an agency that was small enough that we did our own investigations. So all that fancy stuff that you see on TV that's completely unrealistic, we did ourselves for crime scenes. So I would never say I love crime, because my oath of office is to stop crime, stop the people perpetrating the crimes on innocent victims. But this novel also brought together, sort of a lot of weaponry, crime. I find the history of criminology fascinating. There's a lot of very interesting crimes in the Victorian era. I won't go into my interest in that because of lack of time, and we want to get all the panelists involved. Dr. Russell may want to sort of jump in here talking about more of that, but I also have been in police work long enough that I've had some very, when you're in police work, especially in a particular city, you don't know the details of investigations, because those legally cannot be, they should not and are not supposed to be revealed to anybody outside the investigation. But you always know, probably you know the person investigating, the homicide. You may know his wife, you may know her husband, you may know who they hang out with, you may hear things on the street. And so, and going to national police organizations, for instance, one of the most chilling conversations I've had in my entire life was with the woman who was a secretary. She was not commissioned personnel. She was a secretary in the office for the law enforcement personnel that monitored parole and parole violations. And one of the officers who worked in that office was Charles Manson's parole officer before the murders. So anyway, I'm going to stop talking so more people can join in. But that's, you know, I just love crime writing. I love fiction. I began as a fiction writer before I was a poet and memoir writer.
That's very interesting. Thank you, Sarah. Dr. Russell, did you want to jump here and anything spark some thoughts on your part that she said?
I'm going to be meta-ironic here and actually ask a question about how postmodern both of y'all's most recent novels are. One of the elements of postmodernity is looking back to the past. And Sarah, your work is set in Prohibition era America, and Eleanor, yours is set in the, I forget, if it's the Edwardian or Georgian period, the one right after the Victorian, I forget, but they're both set in earlier times, and the worlds there are much more dapper, more sophisticated. The culture is sort of more stable, even though there's rottenness function in it. Could you talk a little bit about why both of you set your works in earlier time?
Eleanor, why don't you go first?
Well, it's probably actually a hang up as a novelist. If I had a character pull out a cell phone, I couldn't continue to write. I couldn't handle. But and as I said, my training is Victorian. I also have to work very hard to convince myself to read things written past about 1930, unless it's mystery fiction or Tim Powers. But the thing that I've never thought of it in terms of being a postmodern writer, except as you were speaking, it was making me reflect on how many times in writing something set in Edwardian, or previously my bloody habit is the very end of the Victorian period, how often I would find myself reflecting on how much has not changed. There is nothing new under the sun. And that things feel at times very precarious in reality now, but looking back historically, imagining how precarious they were for another civilization, the feelings of fracture. I'm not writing in Prohibition time, but I know there too, if we got to writing right after World War I, just the sense of instability is one that we can probably relate to. So I find going back very illuminating for me now, but it's probably just the practical hang up that I cannot write in the present day. I shut down. The present day is full of laundry and small children and bills and that sort of thing. I need to escape a little bit from reality to encounter it in fiction.
That is really interesting. Thank you, Eleanor. It's a lot of babies and a lot of laundry. I get it. Sarah, did you want to comment on that theme?
Sure. I would second and thank you, Dr. Russell, for the very interesting question. I would second Eleanor's thought process in that I think the fiction writer by nature loves, or should love, may I be so bold as to use the word should, love the use of the imagination. And I think for literature or other types of writing, but particularly fiction that actually uses the imagination within a Catholic or Christian worldview, then that is the exercise of the imagination, as Aquinas spoke of, as one of the faculties of soul. So I love fiction writing. In a way, I didn't have a choice about this particular era because my co-author had established the era based on, interviews with mafia personnel that he knew. He's a little older than me, so it was mafia personnel from this era. And but I love this era. This is an era where I had older uncles who fought in World War II, and as far as I know, we're not criminals, but sometimes things are hidden in the mist of time. Especially down there in South Texas, there are things that happen in South Texas that don't happen anywhere else in the U.S., even back in the 1920s. So, but I like the era, and I like the era because it enabled me to do a lot of historical research to make sure that I could solve problems appropriately to the era and to actual history.
That's interesting. Eleanor, I think relevant might be the quote we put up on our Eventbrite. I don't know if everyone got a chance to read it, but you said that you abhor, I forget, the modernist corruption of the vampire. What is the modernist corruption of the vampire?
He's a misunderstood predator who's somehow supposed to be the romantic hero. And he's devoid of the real, when you take away good and evil, he's just the transgressive outsider, right? We just don't understand him. He just has an alternate form of life, and it just makes me crazy.
Thank you.
I'm sorry. Someone said thank you. So I'm very anti-Twilight, very anti the Vampire Diaries. I even have issues with Interview with the Vampire, serious issues with Interview with the Vampire, because I see it as laying that groundwork. No, it's just, when I want to write about vampires, I want to go back and fight with the romantics and their misreading of the vampires. I want to reestablish the moral grounding. Yeah. Predators aren't sexy. Predators are not sexy. They're evil.
So it's a kind of fusion of James Dean and the vampire. It's like, there is this overarching tendency to do this, Wicked, take the witch and tell her backstory and humanize her and make her the good guy.
Well, Maggie, the same thing happens with criminals. I mean, I hope I'm not stepping on anybody's toes here. That's not my intention, but you have serial killers, you have serial sexual assault perpetrators. I have a friend who's worked for 10 years in computer crimes against children. And if I even told half of a story of his cases, which I happen to know because sometimes I help him shred cases, none of us would be able to eat dinner. I mean, we shouldn't be able to eat dinner. So you have, but Hollywood and, some of the usual suspects that participate in creating what Hollywood creates would have us do this sort of weird secular sentimentality or humanist sentimentality of evil, whether it's the vampire or, other more current forms.
Well, there is, though. I mean, I think you're right, but there is obviously this almost vampiric, erotic attraction of the evil for some women, right? Which is what the vampire, the seductive aspect of the vampire. But you see it, serial killers get women falling in love with them and writing to them in prison. It's a disturbing aspect, really, but it's not made up whole cloth either. And the idea of the anti-hero is also can be a rebellion against corrupt social structures, and so when a society becomes confused or corrupted, then that theme emerges. And I'm not sure, it goes to the question of what we want fiction to do. And on the one hand, we long for heroic heroes to emulate. And I almost feel like it's generational. Like one generation of writers creates romantic heroes, and the next generation says, oh no, reality is not like that. Let me expose for you what reality really is, because that's a lie. And I don't know if any of either of you or Dr. Russell has a reaction to that kind of, the Victorian, I love the Victorian novels, but it's obviously true that when you read Anthony Trollope, you are not seeing the whole of society there. And there is a reaction against that, which is a truth-telling instinct, as well as maybe less noble things. Anyone want to jump in and comment? Does that spark any thoughts? Maybe not. We can move on. Dr. Russ?
I think there's a quote from Alistair McIntyre, if I'm not wrong. He was talking about the Bloomsbury group, which I think is an Edwardian, maybe it's a Georgian Barrett, I don't know. But and he points out that they thought they were rebelling against Christianity, but they were rebelling against the Victorian period. And there's also another meme that the 60s generation is rebelling against the Eisenhower period. It's not rebelling against institutional Christianity per se. And I think that's an important point to make. And I think that, we have, the 50s in our mind is like Leave It to Beaver, but it's also was Mad Men too, to a certain degree. And so I think that we shouldn't valorize anti-heroes at all. I think this resentful desire to destroy older civilizations and cultures is bad. But if done correctly, a critical appraisal of the situation can be good. I think that the problem is falling down the rabbit hole, in the sense of I think that a neo-noir work, The Dark Knight by Christopher Nolan, which has been on my mind a lot working on this book. Yeah. Excuse me, the Joker is a perfect example where it's or Bane in The Dark Knight Rises. They're criticizing legitimate hypocrisy and corruption and, to a certain degree, wealth inequality, but then it just goes out of control and it has to be sort of reset. So I think that there can be ways to be critical and, in a positive sense, deconstructive, I'd qualify that, without being a nihilist or trying to tear the whole thing down.
Yeah, and I think different artists have different callings too. And I think we live in an age where we're extremely hungry for heroes and where institutionally all our heroes are being destroyed. But if you think generationally, those who came of age in the 50s, the Eisenhower conformists that the 60s rebelled against, lived through the Great Depression and then defeated the Nazis in a world war where we now know the outcome, but they didn't know who was going to win. And then social order, goodness, decency were extremely important to them, and their children who were raised with abundance and social order, and not that there weren't bad things happening as well, because there always are, are the ones who rebelled against conformity and gave us the 60s, which tore down quite a bit. So I don't know. I think a lot about it when people talk about the good old days, and I'm like, well, you mean when a quarter of America was out of work for 10 years and we had the Dust Bowl and a lot of people didn't know what they were going to eat. We now have YouTube videos about depression recipes by old people. I watch them too. And then Tolkien's vision of the Great War was really an imaginative incarnation in a way of the reality of what it was like to fight World War II when you don't know the outcome, right? Except that God wins in the end. So I don't know, that dynamic, that push-pull me between authenticity, revealing the truth, and the need for the imagination. We can't see goodness, or we're never going to see a good society till Christ comes again. So it's always, do we idealize the goodness that we see in order to encourage more people to do that? Or do we expose the evil that's there in the hopes that something good will happen? And I don't know quite. I just tend to think that fiction writers and artists generally have different callings in that regard, even though if you don't believe in the existence of good, why are you bothering creating anyway? It takes a lot of effort to create something, right?
Well, Maggie, I might be so bold to say that I think creation, even in the arts, for a certain number of people, as in any field, is more about power and control or ego. And I'm not saying we should not have egos, but I've been in other secular scenes, including literary, in the publishing literary world, but in other worlds as well. And so I think, that creative spark manifests for a lot of different reasons and a lot of different kinds of people. And the only responsibility I can say that I believe I have as a Catholic writer is to try to manifest according to my worldview. And my worldview includes good and evil. It includes free will. It includes the incarnation and so forth. So even if, like in a book like this, where you're going to find a lot of violence, it's a thriller, it's a suspense crime thriller. You're going to include a little bit of, making love. You're going to include the typical mafia kind of talk. But at least for me as a creator, and I hope this comes through whether the audiences are interested in spiritual realities or not, there is a certain integrity to how the people live. And when they do certain things, certain results follow, whether you call them positive or negative results. So I think that kind of worldview is of great interest and great, potentially far-reaching effects, because you can read a lot of crime fiction and not have those components.
Thank you. Plug for the Carlucci betrayal. Michael Bracken says, not since The Godfather has a mafia family captivated readers the way the Carlucci brothers do in Robert Wilkins and Sarah Cortez' rollicking novel of love, lust, and naked ambition. So I have ordered my copy. I haven't actually finished it yet, so I'm looking forward to that. I want to widen the conversation to include the audience we have, so please put your questions, comments in the chat box. Elise Williams asks, on the idea of the anti-hero, could you, Mrs. Nicholson in particular, and other panelists, speak about the emergence of the anti-hero in Romantic and Victorian literature, and whether whether or not vampire and Gothic fiction, by extension, is a reaction to or against that idea?
Thank you, Elise. It's definitely, there is an influence from the Romantics, who were themselves, I have to chuckle because they were reacting to the Enlightenment and saying the Enlightenment says everything is can be tested by human reason, can be measured by the scientific method. No, there is something beyond. And it brings to mind Percy Shelley, who, along with James Joyce, if he makes it to heaven, I'm going to kick him in the shins when I get there, because I loathe Percy Shelley. Genius, but vicious man. But his idea, following with the other Romantics, was that the Romantic poetic ego could conceptualize things beyond the natural world. This is why they somewhat playfully saw Satan in Paradise Lost as the proper anti-hero. He was the one they were plugging for because he had the best speeches. God was boring. He could create the beauty, so-called, of hell, the construction of pandemonium. And Percy went on to love the idea of Prometheus. Prometheus unbound. Prometheus has that spark of divine fire, and he gives it to man. Then they get all embroiled in the Gothic, the origins of the Gothic. You can look to Shelley and Byron, who were staying together at Lake Geneva, and Shelley's then wife, Mary Shelley, started writing Frankenstein, which was very much a product of the very diseased community in which she was living, but trying to work out these ideas of man, the hero, the anti-hero, and tagging on to what Sarah was saying, consequences. I think this is how you play the anti-hero, actually. and it makes me think of the film noir movie Where the Sidewalk Ends with Dana Andrews, where he is a corrupt cop and he accidentally kills someone, but then continues to investigate a crime and to try to cover up the murder. Well, he has to bring the villains to justice, but he also has to suffer some degree of justice at the end by confessing the fact that he beat someone to death accidentally, but he still beat someone to death. So there have to be consequences when you have this anti-hero, whether he's going to throw off the shackles of whichever period he's reacting to, like the Romantics. Percy's his wife, Mary Shelley, when she wrote Frankenstein, Dr. Frankenstein is pursued. The end of the book is his pursuit, not a triumphant stance. He is pursued by the demons he has aroused by his anti-hero actions. So, and there are deep ties with the vampire novel, and even the notion of the vampire as sexy, that also came from that particular group. Lord Byron's personal surgeon Polidori wrote the story The Vampire, who is suave, very Bela Lugosi. But that idea that what do you do when someone who is pathological, a genius, pathological, but also attractive, it's a very dangerous realm. Mary Shelley certainly experienced that firsthand. I think it's a very fascinating, messy business to get into that, and to try to shine the light of faith onto that particular group, but also very rewarding to look closely. So thank you for the question, Elise.
Dr. Russell, do you want to say anything about that?
No, those are very good comments. The only two or three quick ones I would make would be one, that there's a book by Stanley Fish, Surprised by Sin, it's called, and it's about how supposedly Milton created Satan in order to be like a temptation, like to show the Christian reader what was located in his or her heart. And so like he intentionally made it appetizing, and then people were drawn to it. This second thing, it's interesting that there's another Christopher Nolan lesser known noir film called Insomnia, which is based on an earlier Scandinavian movie, but in there, that's his only film where there is the light of truth, because there's the same situation where there's a police officer who committed a crime in order to solve a crime, and then like he's overwhelmed by the light coming in from Alaska, but it's very symbolic of the truth. It's Nolan's sort of least postmodern film present in there. And I think that the last point I would say, that there is this tremendous sympathy for the anti-hero today. Like there's that more recent Joker film, and there's the Joker from The Dark Knight, and a lot of people are very much attracted to that. And what's really disheartening is that the Joker now represents the everyman. He's no longer a marginal figure like Travis Bickle was in Taxi Driver. And it's kind of disturbing, especially the past couple of generations, where this literally psychopathic villain becomes now the everyman, and sort of like the anti-hero is kind of, now dominates overall the landscape. I mean, the last point, the more recent, the Batman trailer, it's celebrating the Batman as being a killer and violent and heartless and seeking revenge. So it's really a strange thing where this little tiny seed now is like the dominant paradigm, I guess.
That's interesting. Do you see no parallels though with the Joker and the Milton's Satan? Like, is there some sense in which a character can become just so much more colorful that I don't know, we're responding to him? I mean, is it really something being thrust on us, or is there some sort of deep tendency here to rebel and to admire the rebels that these artists are reflecting rather than causing?
Well, Milton was a Puritan, and like there is this sort of revolutionary ethos there. And I think for the Joker as well, like seeing a lot of people, especially now that the end of history is over, a lot of people, younger generations, are poor, are marginalized, are resentful, and they see this decadence that's there, and there's a strong temptation to tear it down. So I think that Paradise Lost is obviously a theological work, but it's also a political work as well. And Nolan's films are as well. So I think the Joker is very appealing in as much as he destroys the social service. He blows up hospitals and burns up like a fire truck and that sort of thing. And there is this tremendous like sense that almost everyone of every ethnic background and age now feels like alienated within their own society, which is a strange thing.
Yeah, well, this could go really rich. I'm now thinking about The Godfather, right? From the movie. Did read the novel, but I'm thinking about the movies, in which there's this. I kind of the old Catholic separation between the kingdom of heaven and the world, and the problem of living in the world, which is full of evil and not being touched by evil. He's not like the Joker, right? I mean, the Godfather is attractive because he has a code, right? He will break God's law, but he doesn't do it randomly or for the purpose of tearing down the world. Mm-hmm. He's trying to sustain his order in the world, right? And I'm wondering, how the reality of original sin affects how an artist or a novelist, or perhaps even a poet like James Matthew Wilson, who I may turn on his video and potentially join us for this conversation, how that changes. I mean, there's the idea of original sin and the fiction writer's task. Anyone want to jump on that? I'm going to get more questions from the audience too. Okay.
Oh, Maggie, I wanted to tack on a PS to Eleanor's most recent comment when she was talking about Frankenstein and Mary Shelley. One of the most interesting articles I read on that book, and this was many years ago, I can't tell you who wrote it, had to do with the number of miscarriages Mary Shelley had within a certain relatively short time period due to her illicit affair with what's his name, the Romantic poet. And in the Victorian era, of course, medicine was very different. If you had a miscarriage, you're probably laying in bed or you're at your house and you're, the bleeding, the bandages, the tubs of blood, etc. Anyway, very interesting sort of visceral, practical reality to the time period directly before she wrote that book. So that's just a very little PS. It doesn't have anything to do with anti-hero. And there's a wonderful question here about architecture, sacred architecture.
Yeah, I was going to ask that next.
You get it? Okay.
Let me just tell it in case everyone hasn't read it. The Carlucci betrayal includes scenes with cathedrals at a number of important times. Miss Nicholson mentioned the convent and Veronica's Veil. Katie Carr's novel, Earth Without Water, has monasteries. What is the role, panelists, of architecture as a sacramental? Go ahead, Sarah. You wanted to go into that.
In my novel, I show the characters reacting to the interior spaces of churches as sacred spaces. Those spaces take them somewhere that they do not enter other than inside those spaces. So even though it doesn't necessarily result in pure saving, the character being saved at that time, that sacred space allows them to go internally places to experience themselves or experience some sense of the divine they wouldn't otherwise.
Eleanor, do you have a comment?
I would absolutely agree. As a very important atmosphere, I know that when I have a character walk into sacred space, whether, as Sarah said, whether all of a sudden that person's going to have a dramatic epiphany and convert, which never happens in my novels, because I wouldn't believe in it if I wrote it. But that encounter, that space is meant to do something, actually rather like the space of the genre itself. That when you're in this crazy, not noir reality or Gothic reality, that it can become a funhouse mirror that illuminates the self. It's supposed to, actually, for the protagonist. Otherwise, it would just be empty atmosphere. But it is supposed to reflect back on the protagonist in some way, sacred space or architecture or just the setting itself. And since as Christians we believe in sacred space, we can have it operate in our novels in hopefully a compelling or an interesting way. And one thing I want to throw in that Sarah pointed out, 100% yes. And if you read the descriptions of Frankenstein, Dr. Frankenstein making the monster, the chapter of the birth of the monster reads like the description of a miscarriage. It's terrifying in that light.
Wow. There's a question about the problem of creating a hero in fiction generally. Is there, like, how challenging is that? Maybe it's less challenging if you're writing in an earlier period. That goes to what Dr. Russell was speaking of. But how do you think about crafting a hero?
I'd say it's super hard. I'd say it's really, really hard. How do you have someone who represents goodness and virtue and living out one's duties of state and without making that person super boring? I love Jane Austen passionately, and I love the novel Mansfield Park. I've met many people who struggle with the heroine of Mansfield Park because she is so virtuous. Alistair McIntyre talks about this in After Virtue. Fanny Price is remarkably good and not everyone's cup of tea. It's very hard to write goodness without being cheesy and lame. I take refuge in humor, personally.
Anyone else want to talk about the challenge of creating a hero?
Maggie, just since
yeah, go ahead.
Just since I was cooking pumpkin seeds while listening to all of this, so they're out of the oven, so I might as well join in for a minute. This has been the big puzzle for me, and you've probably heard me talk about this in the past, but has been the chief modes of our literature tend to be tragic, and so it's an ongoing problem for the Christian artist to figure out what's the place of tragedy within the Christian cosmos or the Christian worldview, as Sarah's describing it. And so the two questions that tend to emerge are: is it possible to do a poetry of joy, and also is it possible to show images of goodness that aren't totally beaten into the clay by events? Because the classical idea of the hero is the one who survives against fate for the longest possible time before things eventually overthrow him. There's no happy ending for a hero in the classical imagination. And so we're heirs to that pre-Christian civilization. And so we too feel sort of quite rightly feel mired in the darkness and the doubtfulness of things in our arts, even if we're committed to a vision of total redemption and fulfillment of all things through the grace of God. And so I think that's the great challenge for the Christian artist, is to figure out how to make these things work. And just one more thing, Russell Kirk always referred to himself as having a Gothic imagination. I have to say, dispositionally, I've got a Christian Platonist imagination, but there's a reason that people like Eleanor and Kirk write ghostly tales and Gothic novels, and it's because it's often only in the encounter with the darkness that people are reminded that there's more to the world than darkness. It just as if you are tempted to think that your life or that human life is valueless, more often than not, and I'll use Simone Weil as maybe the great exemplar in this regard, more often than not, it's actually in the experience of our own suffering or in the experience of the suffering of others where we're sort of forcibly reminded of the intrinsic dignity of the human person. And so it's both a blessing and a curse that actually the resources for being reminded of the significance of things, including the significance of our own lives, often come through darkness, pain, and suffering more often than they do through praise and joy, even if praise and joy are finally more ultimate than those other things. So that presents a huge challenge for the artist.
Do you know what the great exception is to that? I think you're onto something, as always, James, but it's the birth of a child, right? If you want to be in touch with the significance of things and a joyful occasion, even more than a wedding, I think the birth of one's children, it changes your relationship with eternity in some way.
Not to plug my own books, but yeah, the great discovery in my own poetry was the decentering effects of fatherhood made it possible to see the world and to give representation to the world in entirely new ways.
I have another question, but does somebody want to leap in here, Dr. Russell?
I want to follow on James really quickly and just add that it definitely, absolutely childbirth, but what does it come through? Blood and sweat and hysterical tears. It's you have to pass through that to get to the joy that just is mind-numbing, how fast that switch flips. But it's the most excruciating pain and complete abandonment, and then absolute bliss. So you still get the darkness into light. Definitely.
Mary Finnegan was making that point as well, although I used a lot of anesthesia myself. But anyway, that's very profound. There's a comment here from Maggie Rosario. I feel that the world today has a fascination with death and evil. So many of the people I meet through working at Starbucks have a strange interest in dark tattoos and clothing. Halloween seems to manifest the dark tendencies of society at large. It's certainly become a very large and expensive secular holiday, what was once and when I was a child, a quaint holiday for children where we got candy from our neighbors. Halloween seems to manifest the dark tendencies. What has happened to modern imagination? Well, that's a big question.
I think that just in the field of vision, there's only death. So it's like Eleanor, like in Keats's, I forget, is it Ode to a Nightingale, where he can't see, like he can only see light coming down dimly and that sort of thing. And then like we went through a period of catching glimpses of God, but now all there is death. And I think that, you know, that kind of responding to the earlier question too, that James Matthew Willison was talking about is the idea that like outside of salvation and eternity, like moments of charity, not simply the pagan virtue of kindness, but like true Christian charity kind of burst through in the everydayness of things. But I think that the world we live in is like increasingly, even just the past 2 years, a dark place where it's hard to see the light streaming through. And I think that you know, noir fiction, I think Gothic fiction is able to capture that, and crime fiction as well, very well. But a truly Christian work would have, which both these works do. I just want to make the comment that I was kind of waiting for the Christian moment to show up in the sense of like the redemption. And when it came, both of them came, it was very fortuitous. It was very, very happy to have that in the end. And kind of, you know, the Godfather, there's all these people watching The Godfather on YouTube, and everyone's making comments, and it's like this, it's kind of like a stoic work. But the Carlucci betrayal, I think, has that one of the elements of it that is very good is that openness to redemption as well. And what's interesting, and maybe Sarah can respond to this, in Martin Scorsese's most recent film, The Irishman, he goes to kind of confession at the end. Robert De Niro's character goes to confession at the end. I don't know if you've seen that and what your thoughts would be on it, because most of the time it ends in some terrible bloodbath or something like that at the very end of the film, of a gangster film.
Has anyone seen The Irishman?
I haven't seen it. Sorry.
All right, we'll have to. I saw it.
I haven't seen that, but I've seen the Goodfellas, which is kind of, I don't know if that's the same time period of the Irishman, but kind of also noir.
Oh, thank you, Caleb. I think we're coming to the end of our hour and a half. I'd like to say that I will stick around for a social 15 minutes. I don't know if any of our panelists can do that, but they're welcome to, or if they need to leave, they can. Leonard makes a comment, perhaps the best hero is one that overcomes temptation to sin, triumphing in that way, like Christ. Can you really make a Christ-like hero as a novelist? Is that even something we can do?
I would say to a limited extent, yes, in as much as the virtues, those who practice the virtues must reflect the goodness of God. But as a Catholic novelist, one of the biggest concerns for me is always to ensure that I'm telling a story that is authentic, that is relatable, and that doesn't stray into proselytism. If you want to hear a compelling presentation of the truths of the faith, you should hear that from a pulpit. And I stopped trusting a novelist or stopped being interested in the story when I'm being preached at. This is actually one of my issues with Tolstoy. I don't like being preached at in a novel, but so for the Christ-like character, you will necessarily reflect Christ if you have self-sacrifice, if you have yearning for a deeper relationship with God, in as much as you were presenting that in your novel, but not necessarily having Christ walk into the novel in person. So it's I think Christ will be reflected in that goodness that Dr. Russell was talking about, but when the story affords the opportunity for it, if that makes sense.
Well, we have various people in the audience throwing out possible examples. The Chronicles of Narnia, which is interesting to me because I think Aslan, who is, of course, a Christ figure, doesn't really, it's almost impossible to translate into film because so much of it is conveyed indirectly by the novel's ability to describe the effect that he has on the characters, right? Their interior reactions in a way that, facial shots in a movie just don't convey. And you got a giant, that's my reaction. I enjoyed the movies, but you got a problem. It's just one big lion there, right? It's a big talking lion. It doesn't really have the same sacred quality to it. And another one points out, here's a couple of other thoughts. So let me lump them together and see if anyone wants to jump in. Android in Blade Runner, Rutger Hauer's character, Clint Eastwood in Gran Torino. We're in films. So what do we think of these as Christ figures? Anyone have some thoughts? Or maybe back to the Chronicles of Narnia. I could add hobbits. I don't know if they're exactly Christ figures. They're more saints than divine, but.
Well, I guess I'll comment on the character in Blade Runner. It's weird. I was driving last night in Atlanta, Georgia. It was raining a little bit, and there was the skyscrapers or whatever they were, and then I immediately thought of Blade Runner, and that. But that, it's an interesting structuralist thing of art shapes your perception rather. But anyways, I think that Rutger Hauer's character is someone who was able to be on one level redeemed, more than a Christ figure. I could be wrong. I think that there's a sense in which he's he achieved some level of humanity there by saving Decker. It is true he is like Christ, he reaches down, he is the dove fly up and that sort of thing. But the tears in the rain is kind of achieves humanity. It's ironic today because we are all turning into cyborgs, even literally right now on Zoom, and so we're becoming more like the androids, where he becomes kind of human in the film.
I'll throw out a literary character that's has a Christ-like aspect. If you read Dracula, and everyone should read Dracula, there's an American who shows up, Quincy Morris. Not going to give much away, but he might sacrifice himself in a Christ-like way that makes absolutely no sense, because he's not really Christ-like, but you need somebody Christ-like because you're fighting a vampire. So there's this weird sort of at the end, you know, and then yeah, there you go. Just take the American because he's sort of embarrassing. So you do get that in sometimes, but it becomes a sort of cheesy trope if you throw it into ham-handedly.
Yeah, Matt, I would say that as a fiction writer, that's not my interest. My interest is not in creating a Christ-like figure. My interest is in creating a very complicated set of characters who face overwhelming odds or complicated odds and act consistent with the rules of the universe they're in and the rules of their personalities. So I think it's a fascinating question, but for me, particularly as a fiction writer, and I think there were some comments from Caleb on virtue, and I think you've covered them already. But one of the things I really liked about him, those comments, were he called to mind the fact that virtue is a learned response. And I'm going to go a little further than what he said. So Caleb, you can correct me, but a learned response is based on will. It's not based on feeling, right? And will is where the training aspect and sort of the steel behind the decision and the will to act comes in. So I think that kind of character with will and action, at least in fiction, functions a little more interestingly to readers. Now, I could be wrong, and of course, we're going to have variation in readers, but, and Caleb, I hope I didn't misstate. Feel free to correct me.
Well, you know, I think portraying a Jesus Christ, other than telling the story of Jesus Christ, which is challenging in itself, but has been attempted in both novels and films, in ways that I think are helpful to the believer. But you've got, I mean, it's a subset of the face of God problem, which we used to talk about. You know, you get to that grand moment where the face of God is supposed to be revealed, but we can't see him except in the person of Jesus Christ. And so in addition to the inner, for a novelist in particular, the inner life, which is part of what the novel can show us, right, I would be challenged to figure out how to portray the inner life of God, the Father, much less the Holy Spirit. So I think we would be asking a lot. There are people who are Christ figures where they sacrifice themselves for the good. That's part of being the hero, really, or at least risking sacrifice. We have Gandalf. I'm going to wrap this up, but people are talking about, there's a lot of interest in Clint Eastwood and Gran Torino and the way he's portrayed as a Catholic character and ends up, you know, in a redemptive figure, which is just part of Hollywood always reaching for Catholic memes when it wants to convey these kind of epic themes of good and evil. It can't find them in the secular culture. And they're never showing you the Novus Ordo Mass as typically practiced in a typical American parish. They're always showing you the Latin Mass. As you know, there was an exception to that recently, and it was so striking to me that I was like, oh, I've never seen a regular Catholic Mass, because, like, what's the point? You might as well go show a New England Protestant, you know, Quaker-like sort of austere preacher sort of thing. And that's not really Quaker-like, but the buildings are. Dostoevsky's The Idiot was supposed to be a Christ figure. Several people mentioned. Does anyone want to wrap up this idea? I get that this goes again to the calling of the artists. Artists are doing great work and making real supernatural realities and the drama of good and evil, and the reality of our temptations, as well as the possibility of redemption. Or, but we're not all called to do the same kind of novel. Any of you tempted? I mean, first of all, Dr. Russell, do you have a favorite Christ figure in film or literature? And after that, maybe we'd ask Sarah and Eleanor if you've ever been tempted to write a Christ figure. I think you told us, but.
Well, I don't know how to, I guess, I'll try to put this the best way I can. So like, there's like doing all this research on Christopher Nolan, you see that Batman, is a Christ figure, but it's also kind of a Vedic figure too, in the sense of like Krishna becomes reincarnated. I think that there is like a phenomenological encounter with Christ himself that is the irreducible Christ, just like the real presence of our Lord in the Eucharist, and that, or with Our Lady as well. And so like you have all these types and you say, oh, this is this goddess and this is this hero and this is that, before Christianity or whatever, but there is something sort of irreducibly, there is the irreducible phenomenon of Christ himself. So I think that oftentimes when we see these figures who are sacrificing themselves, obviously, they are, in as much as they're made in the year 2021, a reference to Christ in some way, but that phenomenon of self-sacrifice is present in pagan literature as well. I think that, there is something that, I guess the idea of radical self-sacrifice out of a pure love and a pure charity and not a stoic obligation or the desire to overcome the pain of seeing your parents killed when you were younger, like in Batman or something like that. I think that would be a definitive Christ figure, one who is perfect love. Perhaps in the Brothers Karamazov, the Christ who appears there and kisses the Grand Inquisitor on the cheek could be an image of that. Although I think that Dostoevsky sort of creates too big of a divide between sort of the tender Christ and the Christ who will come to judge the living and the dead.
That old New Testament thing again. Thank you, Dr. Russell. Eleanor Borg Nicholson, Dr. Russell has 2 books coming out from Lexington Press. The Redemption of Geoffrey Hill, which when it's out, maybe we could have you back and talk about that, because I think that's very interesting. And Liberalism and Fantasy and Christopher Nolan. You can't order them yet, but Lexington Books is publishing them, and we'll hope to let you know when they come out. Sarah Cortez, The Carlucci Betrayal. Not since The Godfather have we fallen so in love with a couple of mafia brothers. So congratulations and kudos, and we hope that you all buy and read the book. Eleanor Borg Nicholson, her first novel of vampires, A Bloody Habit, and now she has Brother Wolf. And as you can tell, they're both extremely good reads and very interesting philosophically and in other ways. So we appreciate your time. We're going to let anyone who wants go, and anyone who stays, including our panelists, please, if you need to go, please excuse yourself, or just do, those of you who've done it before, afterwards, we just have a little social time and chat and get to meet a few of the people who show up, and it's a lot of fun if you have time. But thank you for coming. Hope to see you again. And it's a wonderful occasion, and we really appreciate it. So let's give, it looks like we've got a small group, which I like. I'm going to switch it to gallery view.
Thank you so much, Maggie. I'm going to go change diapers. Welcome. I'm going to remove this.
Good,
so.
good.
I'm
5 kids, I know.
Thank you so much. Take care, everyone.
Thank you, Dr. Russell. All right, we've got the hardy, and I am going to call on Mary Finnegan. Did you just go? You just went. All right, I was going to call on you. James, you want to turn on your... Are you there? I'm sorry, who? There you go. You just switched places. I'm asking you to unmute and say hello, Mary.
Hi, how are you?
Where are you coming to us from?
I'm coming from Philadelphia.
And what do you do? What's your life like? What's your day job? How do you spend your time?
I'm a nurse, and I'm one of the poetry candidates in the MFA program at University of St. Thomas.
Oh, so James Matthew Wilson, who's on, and Joshua Haren with Wise Blood Books. That's very exciting. So have you started? You've launched? You're in the program?
It's wonderful.
Give us a little insight. How was it what you expected? James, pretend you're not listening. What did you find most exciting about it? Maybe what did you not expect, or what's it like to be part of that program?
It's wonderful. It's incredible. Honestly, I feel so blessed because I was looking for a group, something like this, thinking that maybe I would, and I did find it in CLA. I have to be honest, I was a member of CLA first, and that was definitely a godsend. And then this program has been just fantastic. I mean, it's a wonderful group of writers. Obviously, Joshua and James are incredible. And it feels as if everything about it is providential, that there are things happening for the good in the world, despite all the bad things in the world at the same time. So,
well, Mary, what are you doing in it right now? Just like this week, what's in the program for you?
So earlier today, I was working on my critiques for the poems that we'd submit for the workshop. So reading and critiquing each other's work. And it's all online. The whole program is online. So you submit online. And so I spent the morning working on some of my classmates' poems, which Tamara, she's here. I worked on hers. And so it's really exciting. Some fantastic work, really work. So
that's terrific. Thank you, Mary. Tamara, do you want to, as long as we're on the topic, and Tamara is a very fine poet who has, I'm sure this is not her chief distinction, but we like to say, we love having published her work at catholicartstoday.com. Tamara, what have you found? You're obviously a very experienced writer and poet. What have you found? What has this program offered you?
I think it's been really interesting. I was actually talking with one of the local workshop leaders in town who's getting his PhD at U of H. And he was describing an experience. He likes to write in sonnet, but he was describing an experience where he was really kind of, I'm not sure if it's U of H or Iowa, where he was kind of ridiculed for liking form. And he was quite stunned to find out that that's actually at the heart of the program at the University of St. Thomas. And so for me right now, it's a very different type of thinking. There's one of the courses is called Craft of Poetry, and it's exploring these very forms that this other poet that I know has, kind of been made fun of for liking. And it's like, so a lot of the writing that I've done previously has been usually inspired in some kind of way. Like there's a line that comes in and it's just very flowing. I had always been very free verse. And so my experience of learning things like simple iambic pentameter and even things about rhyme is more like a craftsman, which is why it's probably called craft of poetry and not like inspiration of poetry, because it's the bricks and the mortar and sort of this very doingness. And so it's a very intellectual type of exercise. It's like learning a whole new thing. So very like different.
Learning a language almost, right?
Yeah. And it's one that I'm not very facile with. And it takes like 6 hours to write something that is probably mediocre at best. But the idea behind it is tell my ego to go sit in a corner for a couple of years. And because I am working on expanding the toolbox that my muse has to then use. And so that form will be an option, or I can be informed or in conversation with form in a way that I haven't been able to. I don't know what it ultimately is going to do for my writing, but it's also being entered into a conversational language. And I'm reminded oddly of a business communication professor of mine who talked about, I know, letters on paper. And he talked about the importance of watermarked paper and making sure that the watermark is the right direction, because people who actually know about paper and watermarks will hold it up to check and see if you knew what you were doing. And I think there's a way in which understanding at least what's going on in the forms gives you a way of communicating with other people that understand, kind of in the way that people who understand about watermarks understand. And so it can't be the primary thing. The poem still has to communicate. It still has to be, at least in my mind, accessible to someone who doesn't have even a college degree, or they have to have a, if somebody, just a thinking human being approaches it, they have to have a chance of getting at it. But that there is this other layer of conversation that you can have, and there are other means that you can use and layer in for those that will know, is really absolutely fascinating. So I'm at the beginning, and poetry is one of those things that you can spend, like any good craft, you can spend decades becoming better at. And I think what I'm excited about with this program is I was always afraid of going to an MFA because I was afraid that it would destroy my writing. And I knew that my writing wasn't anywhere near where I wanted it to be, but I knew it could be destroyed. And what I trust in the MFA at University of St. Thomas is that it won't be destroyed. It can only be strengthened. So there you go. That was a lot.
No, that's beautiful. Can you tell us, Tamara, roughly, of your fellow students, and obviously you're taking courses about poetry, but how does it divide up between novelists, playwrights, and poets or screenplay writers?
So for this first semester, the two streams aren't mixing. So both classes that I have are 100% poets. One of them is a poetry workshop, and one of them is a craft class on. But next semester, depending on which literature class I select, it will blur. I think I think the cohorts are about similar size. And then there's also an in-person residency where the streams will meet. But James will have to answer how many fiction writers there are and how many poets there are.
Do you want to weigh in, James?
Yeah, let's see. I think it's almost totally equal. So our class is all filled up. So, and we have the same amount of room for fiction writers and for poets. But then our class is filled up, and then we had some students delay enrollment. They enrolled and then they decided to wait a semester or a year. So I'm just thinking of okay, so now I'm being a program administrator and I'm trying to get the number exactly correct, but you don't need to know that.
We don't need to know that. No, that's
what you need to know is that we have roughly 20 poets in the program and roughly 20 fiction writers. Wonderful.
Are these the numbers you want, or are you going to expand in the future?
We wanted to be smaller than that, but we kept getting people that we didn't want to turn away. And so, and then some people, like, Sarah's doing the program, even though she's also on the faculty of the program. And Sarah and Mary are both just taking one class this semester. And so we want the program to be entirely flexible and up to each student in the program to decide how many courses they want to take, when they want to complete the degree, and so on and so forth. So when we decided to have that flexibility in the program, we lost control over the precise number of students to have in the program, because somebody might be admitted to the program and just take one course, another person would take two. Right. So we're kind of walking a tightrope. But in any case, so we actually have more students in the program than we intended to admit, which is beautiful, because in the short term it made it logistically challenging for us. But we now know that there's such a demand for this program that the kinds of expansion that we wanted to happen 2 or 3 years down the road are going to happen next fall.
And what is that?
Well, we'll be adding. This is unofficial, but unless something sabotages things for us, Jessica Hooten Wilson will join us to teach one course a semester. And then A.M. Juster, the former poetry editor of First Things and now poetry editor of Plow, and translator of the complete poetry of Petrarch, which is forthcoming. He is going to be teaching, the plan is for him to teach the craft of poetry for us next fall. So we're able to get people really distinguished people who we wanted to be part of the program in our virtual classroom much sooner than we had anticipated.
I'm going to put in a pitch here for starting a playwright track, but maybe I'll bend your ear about that.
Oh, you don't even need to put in the pitch. It's all coming. It's just, okay. it's a matter of raising a few $1 million, but we'll do it. and then we're going to add playwriting and screenwriting. Probably before that, we'll add memoir and essay.
Excellent. Yeah, we definitely have to talk sometime. Can I ask Kate? Yes, go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say that 70% of the poetry students are CLA members. I'm not,
that's wonderful. You've
and
what a wonderful ecology.
Catholic and I don't know what percentage of the fiction writers are, but they're fiction writers who are as well. So we might have accidentally and joyously, I might add, contributed, a high percentage of CLA members to that program.
Well, this is what Dana Gioia refers to as the ecology of a culture, or in our case, perhaps a subculture, but getting the pieces in place. And I know that what you're doing is very important, and I'm glad to hear that it's fed into the success of what James Matthew Wilson and Joshua Horan are doing. That's wonderful. I was gonna, it looks like we may have lost him. Is Caleb still on? Oh, yes, there you are, Caleb. You keep, they move you around on Zoom. Can you unmute yourself and say hi?
Yes, yep. Glad to be here. Thanks for putting it on. Appreciate it. So
where are you coming to us from?
From Sioux Falls, South Dakota. So I moved here last year, and I guess a little bit about myself, but I'm 26 years old, but I've spent a little more than half my life. I grew up in southern Minnesota, and then my other half in North Dakota in Fargo. So and then I knew Dr. Russell he's my philosophy teacher at University of Mary. So had a few really good classes with him. But yeah, but now in South Dakota, and I do construction work, and I just got married this past summer, and me and my wife are expecting, so pray for us.
Oh, wonderful.
And, so very exciting time, and just kind of writing when I have time, but I've never yet built up that habit to write, so I get all the ideas, but I don't have the follow through. So
well, it's hard to do it in isolation too. So I really think you might look at Catholic literary arts, and we're glad you're here. Come back, because we'll be doing more things too.
Yes, thank you.
Part of the challenge for an artist in America is taking your calling and your craft seriously when so much of the world does not. Mm-hmm. And there were others here probably heard me say that I was really struck by this when I learned that John Donne, who is one of the greatest poets in English of all time, never published a single poem. He just wrote, a bunch of poets got together and wrote for each other. And 400 years later at Yale, I'm studying and loving his poems. So, but I really admire you. I admire you for daring to enter the adventure of marriage and fatherhood. That's just a wonderful blessing. And for continuing. So I hope you continue with your calling and see where it takes you. And if nothing else, you can be singing poems to your children down the road.
Thank you.
Love that. Yeah.
And kind of before I mute myself, one thing that I have thought of throughout this whole video, and I can't even remember what it's from, but I was kind of on a G.K. Chesterton binge 4 or 5 years ago, and I remember he wrote nothing more heroic than, or like a father or a mother raising children, and I think that's very, inspiring to all of us, or, whether we have children or maybe some of us are godparents or priests or religious sisters, that there is nothing to be ashamed about living a normal life and living a life of virtue.
Well, having children is a great gift. It's a great gift of love. And as you say, a heroic venture into the unknown. And I hope you'll come back and show us some babies or baby pictures.
I'll be back. Yeah.
Time. All right.
You.
Excellent.
Yes.
I think maybe we're approaching the half an hour. So maybe I can ask Mary Alice Dixon to say hello and introduce herself, and then ask Father Dorn to give us a blessing on the way out.
Well, I'm here because I'm a big fan of Sarah's. I just think her work is wonderful. And I have to say, one of the things in her cop essays, she says, we memorized each other's stories as if our lives depended on it. And I really feel that, you know, that's what sharing work is about. That's what writing is about. I'm coming to you from Charlotte, North Carolina. I used to be a professor. I used to be an attorney. I represented children in child abuse cases and their parents, guardian ad litems and incompetencies, legal aid, tenants in housing disputes. And for the past 10 or 11 years, I have been a hospice volunteer, which I love. It's such a privilege. It's such an honor. And writing for me, Thomas Merton and Flannery O'Connor are my great loves among many. And for me, I always refer to Merton's like writing is a kind of prayer that we try to pray when we write, however it is. And so I'm just so grateful to have found you all and to have found CLA and the Benedict Institute. So thank you. This has just been a wonderful discussion, a wonderful conversation. And I'm grateful to be here. So thank you.
Mary Alice, it strikes me between your life work with abuse, children in abuse cases, and hospice work, that's an awful lot of material for art. Are you also working on that side, or is that not something you feel called to do?
Well, of course
Are you just a reader, or are you a reader?
No, I write a lot. I write and have published poetry, fiction, nonfiction, across the genres. And of course, I am bound to respect the confidentiality, as our priest knows well, as all of us know, Sarah. But I think for everyone I know who writes, and I have many friends here in Charlotte who are writers, we all draw from the wellspring of pain that we've seen. I mean, one of the things that I loved about this discussion is saying, you know, Catholics are a little weirder than other people because we believe in evil and in good. And so, there's an endless source. Everything in life is a story to me. Everything tells stories, from a tree, you know, to a pebble, to a child. And I'm a mother too, so I really like to hear about the blood, sweat, and tears there.
Do you have a website, or I'm just going to have to go out?
No, I'm sort of a Luddite. I'm really kind of not very digital.
I get it. Yeah.
But
I don't have a website.
I mean, I have there's some things that are on links that I've shared a couple with Sarah on occasion, but
well, I'll have to count on Google to take me there, or ask Sarah for some help. But thank you so much for joining us. I hope you come back.
Please do this again. Yes.
We do a couple of these a month at least, and not always about writers, but sometimes composers and sometimes painters and sometimes liturgical.
Yes. The Veronica's Veil really struck me, because I kept thinking when we were talking about heroes, about all those temptations of St. Anthony. You know, those medieval and Renaissance paintings of St. Anthony, like there's a hero.
Oh, wow. That's deep. Father Dorn, you want to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself before giving us a closing prayer or blessing?
Well, thank you, and I won't take long. I'm actually an Anglican priest.
Oh, wonderful.
Quasi-Anglican, I guess, but I write Catholic supernatural fiction because Protestants just don't have as much fun with.
And where are you coming to us from? Where are you?
Denver, Colorado. And here in Colorado, we also have the St. Anselm Society, which is another organization devoted to promoting excellence in literature and music, faith-based. inspired by.
Well,
And
we'll have to Google that. St. Anselm
the Anselm Society. I've been married 35 years. And while my children were little, I was a playwright. I have about 100 published children's plays. And when they grew up and didn't want to do theater anymore, I started writing weird Westerns. Because like one other person said, I don't want to have to deal with cell phones in my stories or modern technology. And lately I've got a series, the Father Declan Supernatural Mysteries, about an Irish Franciscan who goes around Ireland breaking curses and setting people free, and it's all redemptive. And he has the gift of insight and has wonderful connections with various saints who help him in this. So I have a lot of fun with it. I'm also a full-time geriatric chaplain and hospice care and things like that. So that's enough about me, but I'm so glad to find your organization, and I hope to participate more in the future. And the background is Church of the Advent, where I serve. I'll be serving tomorrow. See, that's the fun thing about being an Anglican priest. You only work one day a week. I'm sure you don't.
Oh, well, you know, we'll try to see where that exploration of the Catholic imagination in your fiction eventually takes you, Father. But thank you for being part of this.
You're welcome.
We're really glad.
Are you willing to accept a blessing?
Yeah, of course.
I found a really good one.
All right.
St. Google helped me find this one. Bless the creators, O God of creation, who by their gift make the world a more joyful and beautiful realm. Through their labors, they teach us to see more clearly the truth around us. In their inspiration, they call forth wonder and awe in our own living. In their hope and vision, they remind us that life is holy. Bless all who create in your image, O God of creation. Pour your spirit upon them, that their hearts may sing and their works be fulfilling. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Thank you all. Thanks, Kevin. Always nice to see you. And if you're in the Bay Area, come out to St. Mary's November 6th at 10 a.m. You good? Kevin's going to be there. Good. All right. Thank you all. Until next time, till we meet again. Bye-bye. Thanks, Sarah.